somewhere between the glare of the stage lights and the shadows backstage, Forest Whitaker learned to exist as two different people who never truly became one. There was the Whitaker the world saw calm, profound, in control of every emotion. And there was another Whitaker, quieter, heavier, carrying pieces of lives that were not his own. He did not just act the characters, he entered them, lived inside them, felt their pain as his own. And then, when the movie ended, those emotions did not disappear. They stayed. They accumulated. They piled up. He gradually traded his inner peace for artistic depth, for understanding humanity to its core. But the price was that he himself slowly began to fade. There were nights when there were no more lines, no more scripts, only silence left, when he had to ask himself who he was, a performer, or the sum total of all the people he had ever become. Living two lives was not a glamorous choice. It was a prolonged endurance, a journey where the will was not in winning, but in not collapsing under the weight of everything he had absorbed. And even though no one truly saw that battle, he kept moving forward, kept performing as the only way to keep himself from completely dissolving. But it was precisely in that quiet sacrifice that Whitaker built a career that very few could ever reach. He was not just an actor, but one of the rare artists who reached the absolute peak of acting when he won the Oscar for Best Actor for his role in The Last King of Scotland, a transformation considered one of the most haunting and authentic in film history. Not stopping there, he also received the Golden Globe, BAFTA, and Screen Actors Guild Award for the same role, affirming his status worldwide. Before and after that, Whitaker continued to leave his mark with works like Bird, which earned him the Best Actor award at the Cannes Film Festival, or major films like The Butler, Arrival, and Black Panther, where he brought characters full of depth and humanity. He was also honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, becoming one of the most enduringly influential figures in the film industry. And beyond the screen, Whitaker is a humanitarian activist, a UNESCO ambassador who has spent many years building peace and education programs for vulnerable communities. A life full of glory, but also clear proof that sometimes, to achieve greatness, a person must accept trading more than what the world can see. Before we dive deeper into the journey of a man who has lived too many lives that no one truly saw, please hit like and leave a heart as a sign of respect for the pains he has never spoken about. And if you want to explore what made Forest Whitaker start this double life from his early years, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next part. If the later part of Forest Whitaker's life was a series of different people layered on top of one another, then everything probably began very early, from a childhood where he learned to stay silent before he learned to express himself. He did not grow up in poverty or deprivation like many other stories people usually tell about legends. His home was comfortable and stable, without dramatic external upheavals, but that very calm carried within it a void that no one truly noticed. In that family space, everything operated according to discipline, responsibility, and clear standards, but emotions were rarely named. There were no long hugs, no straightforward words about sadness, no conversations that helped a child understand what he was truly feeling. And for a sensitive soul like Whitaker, that absence was not a small thing. It was a prolonged silence, where he gradually learned to keep everything inside. While other children grew up by expressing themselves, reacting, arguing, or seeking attention, Whitaker followed a different path. He observed. He watched how people talked, how they smiled, how they hid what they did not want to say. He was not the one standing at the center of any room. He was the one standing on the edge, quietly, almost invisible, but seeing more than anyone else. And it was from that position that something important took shape. He began to understand people, but not through sharing, rather through silently absorbing. There were moments in childhood that no one remembers, but left the deepest marks. Quiet evenings where no one asked what he was thinking, days when he felt sad but did not know who to tell, or even what to call that feeling. Gradually, instead of trying to express it, he chose to hold it in, not because he wanted to hide, but because he did not know what else to do. And over time, holding it in became instinct. Whitaker grew up as someone who lived more in his inner world. He could sit for hours, not speaking, only thinking, only feeling. But the sad thing was, the deeper he felt, the more he distanced himself from the outside world, not because he did not want connection, but because he did not know how to do it without losing the safety that silence provided. For him, silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a refuge, and it was precisely in that refuge that a dangerous habit slowly formed. He began to hide his emotions even when it was not necessary. Even when there was a chance to open up, he still chose to hold back. Even when pain appeared, he learned to endure it alone, not because he was stronger than others, but because he had never been taught that pain could be shared. There is a sad paradox in the way Whitaker grew up. He understood others very clearly, but did not understand how to let others understand him. He could look into someone's eyes and know what they were hiding, but when he himself was hurting, he could not do the same for himself. That made him a person who was both profound and lonely, a person with the ability to feel the world at a level few could reach, but with nowhere to put those emotions down. Looking back, one can see that Whitaker's second life, the life he lived through his characters, was not something that appeared suddenly. It had been prepared for a long time, from the years he learned to observe instead of participate, to feel instead of share, to endure instead of express. He did not become an actor to become famous. He became an actor because that was the only way he knew to release what had been held inside for too long. But what no one realized at the time was when a person becomes so used to hiding himself so deeply, becoming someone else could become much easier than becoming himself. And that was exactly the beginning of a journey where later he would have to pay with his own sense of self, a journey where the farther he went, the harder it became to return. But then, when everything seemed to have stabilized in that familiar silence, life suddenly took away from Forest Whitaker the only thing that made him feel he had a clear direction: football. It was not just a sport, not just a youthful hobby. For Whitaker, it was the only escape from the cramped inner world he had lived in for too long. On the field, he did not need to explain who he was, did not need to speak the emotions he did not know how to name. Everything became simple: run, collide, fight, survive. There he was no longer the boy standing on the edge observing. He was part of the game, part of the team, part of something bigger than himself, and in that brief moment, he felt he belonged somewhere. That was why, when the injury happened, it was not simply a physical wound. It felt like a sudden severance, a direct blow to the part of life he had just begun to build. There was no warning sign, no time to prepare, just one moment, and everything he believed in suddenly became meaningless. The training sessions, the hopes, the visions of the future all vanished so quickly that he could not even understand what had happened. And when the physical pain gradually subsided, another pain began to emerge, quieter but much deeper. He was no longer an athlete, but he was not yet anyone else either, and it was precisely the emptiness in between that frightened him the most. For the first time in his life, Whitaker had no role to hold on to, no identity to claim, no clear path ahead. Only one question remained that he did not know how to answer. If not this, then who am I? The days that followed were not recorded in any book, did not appear in the press, and no one mentioned them. But those were the days that shaped who he became the most. He walked through each day as if moving through fog. No goal, no motivation, no faith. What had once been his anchor now became memory, and memory was not enough to help a person keep moving forward. He began to feel something he had never named before: emptiness. Not intense sadness, but a prolonged void where everything lost its meaning. There were moments when he tried to convince himself that this was just a phase, that he would find something else. But the more he tried, the more he realized that not everyone could easily replace a dream that had become part of himself. Football was not just a career choice. It was how he defined himself, and when it disappeared, that part of the definition disappeared with it. The most painful thing was not losing an opportunity. It was realizing that life was not as fair as people thought, that nothing was certain, that everything could be taken away in just one moment, without reason, without warning. That was the first time Whitaker faced that cruel truth, and that truth has not left him since that day. In that emptiness, he returned to the only thing he had ever done before: observing. But this time, he was not only observing others. He began to observe himself. He looked into the void inside, trying to understand where it came from, trying to fill it in any way he could. But the more he looked, the more he realized that the void was not something that could be easily filled. It was like a part that had been taken away and could not be replaced. And it was precisely in that disoriented period that something quietly happened. It was not a clear turning point, not a big decision. It was just a very small shift. He began to try stepping into another world, a world where he could become anyone, where he did not need to face the question, "Who am I?" directly, because he could temporarily become someone else. It was not a solution, but at that moment, it was the only way he knew to keep existing. Looking back, it can be said that the day he lost his football dream was not just the day one path closed, it was the day his first life ended, and in the painful emptiness that followed, another life, quieter, more complex, and also more dangerous, began to form, one that even he at that time could not fully understand the price he would have to pay. And then, in the void left by the old dream, Forest Whitaker did not step into acting as someone pursuing a passion, but as someone looking for a place to hide. There was no "this is what I was born to do" epiphany moment. There was no feeling of certainty. It was just a door that opened at the exact time when he no longer knew where to go, and he stepped into it, not with the desire to become someone great, but simply to avoid facing himself in the overwhelming emptiness. There, for the first time after the injury, he realized he could exist without having to answer the question, "Who am I?" because in each role he could become anyone else. At first, they were just small experiments, training sessions, classes, time standing on stage that no one knew about. But very quickly, Whitaker realized something he probably had not expected himself. He did not need to try hard to get into character. He had been used to observing people since he was very young. He had spent his entire childhood watching how others hid their emotions, how they smiled when sad, how they stayed silent when in pain. And now, everything he had accumulated in that silence began to have a place to show itself, not through his own words, but through the words of the characters. Acting, for many people, is a dream. But for Whitaker, it was not a dream. It was a hiding place. It was where he could set down what was too heavy inside himself by transferring it to another person. It was where he could cry without needing to explain, could get angry without reason, could love, could hurt, could collapse all, without anyone asking him why. Because it was not him, it was the character. And that created a release he had never had before. But it was also there that a dangerous truth began to form. When a person becomes used to releasing emotions through others, they gradually lose the ability to do it for themselves. Whitaker did not learn how to face his own pain. He learned how to transfer it to a role. He did not learn how to understand himself. He learned how to understand others. And little by little, the boundary between the two became blurred. There were days when he walked into acting class with a rare sense of relief. Not because he was happy, but because he did not need to be Whitaker for a few hours. He could be a man who was losing everything, a desperate father, a person trying to atone, or even someone completely foreign to what he had known. And in those moments he felt more real than ever, a paradox that only those who have lived too long in silence could understand. But when the class ended, when the lights went out, when everyone returned to their lives, Whitaker had to return to himself. And it was precisely those transition moments that were the hardest, because after feeling so much, after living so many different lives in a short time, returning to being himself was not a normal return. It felt like a fall, an emptiness that came back, but this time even deeper, because he had known what it felt like to escape from it. Gradually, acting was no longer just a choice. It became an inseparable part, not because he loved it in the usual way, but because he needed it to keep himself from being completely submerged by the things he could not explain. He began to live more in the characters and less in himself. He spent more time understanding the motivations of others than understanding his own emotions. And over time, that was no longer a skill. It became a way of existing. People saw an actor maturing, finding his path. But inside, Whitaker was stepping into a second life without a map, a life where he could become anyone except himself. And the saddest part was that he did not realize it right then. Because for someone who had been used to hiding emotions since childhood, losing himself was not a sudden shock. It was a slow process, almost invisible, until everything had completely changed. Whitaker's second life did not begin with a big decision. It began with very small moments. Those times he chose to stay longer in a character. Those times he brought those emotions home. Those times he felt he could breathe easier when he was someone else. And step by step, no one realized that the man was gradually disappearing from his own life, making way for the people he had created. And then, when that second life gradually became the only place where he felt he could exist, Forest Whitaker began to take on his first roles with an approach that not everyone understood. He did not act. He dissolved into them. While many actors learned to keep a safe distance from the character to protect themselves, Whitaker did the opposite. He went deeper, closer, and let those emotions touch the deepest parts inside him. Not because he wanted to prove anything, but because he did not know any other way to do it. For him, if he did not feel it for real, then nothing was real. And that very authenticity, even though it made his roles come alive in an astonishing way, also began to take more from him than he realized. In each role, he did not just learn the lines or the gestures. He explored the character's pain, the reasons they became the way they were, the wounds they carried. And when he understood, he did not stop at performing it. He let it enter him. He let it stay. He let it live with him, at least throughout the filming period. But the problem was that those kinds of emotions were not something that could be easily turned off when the director called cut. They did not follow the script. They did not disappear with the lights. They lingered, quietly but persistently. There were days when he left the set, but still carried the character's mood like an inseparable shadow, a sadness that did not belong to him, but he still felt it, an anger that was not his, but still smoldered inside. And gradually, as the roles piled up on one another, those emotions also began to pile up. It was no longer clear what belonged to the character and what belonged to him. There was no longer a clear boundary between acting and living. Only a state of mixed existence remained, where everything blended together to the point it could not be separated. Whitaker did not talk about this. He did not complain. He did not explain to anyone that each role for him was not just work, because perhaps even he himself did not fully realize the extent of what was happening. He only knew that the deeper he immersed himself, the more he was recognized, the more he let emotions guide him, the more distinctive he became. And in an industry where true authenticity rarely existed fully, that became his greatest advantage. But it was also his greatest trap. There was a very small but important change that began to happen in the way he saw himself. Before, he was the one who observed the world, but now he began to look at himself through the lens of the characters. He was no longer sure which emotions were his, which reactions were natural, which thoughts truly belonged to him. And when a person begins to lose the ability to distinguish those things, they do not just lose clarity, they begin to lose themselves. Those around him could see an actor becoming increasingly excellent, increasingly profound, but they did not see the price he was paying. They did not see the nights he lay in silence, carrying emotions he did not know where they came from. They did not see the moments he had to pull himself out of a state that should not exist outside of real life. They did not see the fatigue accumulating, not from the work, but from always having to be many people at once. And the saddest part was that all of this happened very slowly. There was no specific moment when he realized he was losing himself. There was no day he woke up and saw that everything had changed. It happened little by little, through each role, through each emotion kept longer than necessary, like water soaking into the soil without making a sound, but gradually changing the entire structure underneath. Whitaker continued to move forward, continued to accept roles, continued to live in different people. And each time like that, a small part of him seemed to be left behind, in a role he had never truly left. It was not a conscious sacrifice. It was the consequence of the way he existed. And when a person becomes used to placing himself in others for too long, they will not realize that they themselves are gradually becoming the most unfamiliar thing. His second life, at this point, was no longer a temporary refuge. It had become reality. A reality that he both needed and could not escape from. And in that familiar silence, the process of losing himself continued, without noise, without drama, but deep enough to change him forever. And as the boundary between himself and the people he embodied gradually disappeared, what had once been Forest Whitaker's greatest gift also began to become a burden that no one could see. The ability to feel emotions at a profound level, the thing that made him different, that made audiences believe in every glance, every gesture, was precisely the double-edged sword that quietly cut into him every day. Whitaker did not just understand the character's pain, he absorbed it. Not in a symbolic sense, but almost in the way a body absorbs a wound. He let those emotions pass through him, stay in him, and sometimes not leave anymore. There were roles that required him to live in a state of continuous trauma, people who were tormented, torn apart, placed in situations where even imagining them was enough to make others look away. But Whitaker did not look away. He stayed. He looked straight at it, felt it, let it touch the deepest parts of his mind. And when he did that long enough times, the inevitable happened. He began to carry pains that did not belong to him as if they were a natural part of himself. To do that, he was forced to distance himself from the world around him. Not because he did not need anyone, but because he could not be himself and the character at the same time. He began to isolate himself. He cut back on unnecessary conversations. He avoided relationships that could pull him out of the immersion state. The days preparing for a role became longer, heavier, and quieter. He lived in a space that very few people could enter, a space where everything was shaped by the emotions of another person. Those around him could see the focus, the seriousness, the dedication. But they did not see the price. They did not see the moments he had to sit alone, trying to understand an emotion he had never experienced in real life, but had to express as if it were his own memory. They did not see the times he brought that emotion home, unable to turn it off, unable to shake it off like a costume after filming. They did not see the long silences where he was no longer sure what he was feeling and why. Whitaker did not talk about this, not because he wanted to keep it a secret, but because he had no language to describe it. How do you explain that there are days you feel heavy without knowing the reason? Because that reason is not yours. How do you say that you are tired, but not because of the work, but because you have lived too many lives in too short a time? Those things were not easy to share. And so he chose silence as he had done since he was a child. But the silence this time was no longer a refuge. It became a distance between him and the world, between him and those around him, even between him and himself. There were times when he no longer reacted the way he used to before, not because he no longer had emotions, but because he had too many emotions to the point he did not know where to begin. And when a person cannot organize what they are feeling, they will choose to feel nothing at all. That was when the real fatigue began. Not the fatigue of the body, but of the mind. A quiet, prolonged exhaustion with no clear end. Whitaker still worked, still showed up, still completed everything like a professional. But inside, he was carrying a weight that no one asked him to carry, and the sad thing was that even he himself did not know how to put it down. There were rare moments when he tried to return to normal life, simple conversations, meetings, minutes not related to work, but even in those moments, a part of him was still somewhere else, still processing an emotion that had not ended, still living in a story that had not been closed, and that made him always feel like he was standing between two worlds without truly belonging to any of them. Over time, that fatigue did not disappear. It only changed shape. Sometimes it was a longer silence than usual. Sometimes it was a slightly emptier gaze. Sometimes it was a feeling of detachment that even he could not explain. But no matter what form it took, it was still there, a reminder that the price of feeling everything too deeply was not something a person could endure forever. And in all of that, the most painful thing was not that he had to carry the pain of others. It was that, after so many years of living like that, he began to no longer be sure which pain was his own. And when a person loses the ability to distinguish that, they are not just tired, they begin to lose their final anchor. And then, when that quiet fatigue had not yet had a chance to be named, life pushed Forest Whitaker up another rung higher, brighter, and also colder than ever. His career began to soar. The roles that previously were only recognized by a small group now spread throughout the film industry. Directors sought him out not only for his technique, but for something rare, the ability to make characters so real that viewers forgot it was only acting. His name began to appear more often, the praises became denser, and the stage lights began to turn toward him with clear respect. But in all of that, there was one truth no one saw. He did not feel he was rising. He was only going deeper. Each new role was not a gentle step forward, but another sinking deeper into emotional territories he had become too familiar with. The characters he chose or was chosen for were not simple people. They were complex, torn, carrying contradictions with no clear answers. And to portray them authentically, Whitaker had to do what he always did: open the door for those emotions to enter. But this time, the intensity was greater, deeper, and longer lasting. No longer fleeting experiences. They were psychological journeys he had to live fully, from beginning to end. People began to speak of him as an irreplaceable actor, someone who could bring a depth that others could not reach. Those praises, for many people, would be a reward, but for Whitaker they felt like a confirmation that he could not return to an easier path. When you have become known for your ability to go deep into the dark regions of humanity, the world will continue to demand that you do it. And he, with everything he had, continued to answer, but each time like that, a part of him was pulled further away from himself. Not in a sudden way, but in a very slow, very quiet way. He still spoke, still smiled, still appeared at events, still fulfilled every role that a successful person needed to have. But inside, the distance between him and his true self grew larger. There were times when he felt like he was observing himself from the outside, just like the way he used to observe others when he was a boy. The only difference was that this time he did not know how to step back in. The pressure also changed shape. It was no longer the pressure to succeed, but the pressure to maintain the depth, to continue delivering roles that audiences believed in, that critics recognized. And that meant he could not choose easier paths. He could not simply act and finish. He had to keep digging deeper, keep searching for the darker, more complex parts of humanity. And each time he dug like that, he had to pay with his own stability. No one asked him to sacrifice to that extent. But no one stopped him either. Because from the outside, everything looked perfect. A rising career, a recognized talent, a position many dreamed of. There was no reason to think that inside something was gradually collapsing. And that very invisibility made everything harder, because when no one noticed you were tired, you also began to believe that you had no right to stop. Whitaker continued to move forward, one role at a time, one project at a time. But the feeling of loneliness no longer came and went as before. It stayed. It became part of his state of living. Not a clear sadness, but a constant distance between him and everything around him. He could be in the middle of a room full of people, but still feel like he was somewhere else. He could hear others talking, but not fully connect with what they were feeling. Not because he did not care, but because he had become used to living in different layers of emotion, where ordinary conversations could not reach. The more successful he became, the clearer that distance became. Not because success itself created loneliness, but because the path to his success required a level of separation that few could understand. He could not be the everyday Whitaker and all the characters he carried at the same time. And when he had to choose, he almost always chose to stay with those characters a little longer, long enough to make them real, but also long enough to make himself become a stranger. There was a sad paradox in his journey. The more he was recognized, the less he felt he existed in the way others saw him. People called his name, praised him, honored him, but what they honored was not the person he was trying to hold on to. It was the parts he had given away, turned into art, placed into roles that the world could understand. The remaining part of the part that could not be acted, could not be explained, remained there in silence, becoming harder and harder to reach. And when loneliness was no longer a fleeting feeling but became a state of living, it no longer frightened people. It became familiar, even in a way. It became the only place where Whitaker felt he could exist without having to try to become someone else. But the price of that familiarity was very great. Because when a person accepts loneliness as part of themselves, they also simultaneously accept standing far from everything that could pull them back. And when loneliness had become a familiar state, Forest Whitaker stepped into a phase where the roles he chose were no longer just complex, but began to carry a weight that was almost impossible to shake off. The characters that came to him or that he sought were no longer ordinary people with simple contradictions. They were broken souls, people torn apart by the past, by violence, by irreversible decisions. And to make them real, Whitaker did the only thing he knew: he let them live inside him. The stories he took part in became darker and darker. The emotions he had to touch became more extreme. It was no longer just sadness or loneliness, but repressed rage, loss of control, moments when people were pushed to their final limits. And Whitaker did not stand outside those emotions. He did not observe them from afar. He stepped in, accepted them, and let them shape the way he thought, the way he fought, the way he existed throughout the filming process. There were days when he woke up and no longer felt like himself before, not because he changed in an obvious way, but because a part of the character was still there, creeping into the smallest reactions, fleeting thoughts, emotions he could not explain. And as the roles continued one after another, those small parts did not disappear. They accumulated, like invisible layers of sediment, piling up over time, until even he no longer knew which layer belonged to him and which belonged to someone else. Whitaker had no switch to turn off the character. There was no ritual to fully exit the role. The things he brought into the role, his authenticity, his commitment, his absolute openness, were exactly what made it impossible for him to shake them off easily. There were emotions that, once awakened at such a deep level, would not return to their original state. They stayed, changing the way he saw the world, changing the way he saw himself. People often talk about sacrifice in art as something noble, but few see its dark side when that sacrifice is no longer under control. Whitaker did not just sacrifice time or energy, he sacrificed clarity about himself. Each time he went deep into a broken character, he had to carry a part of that brokenness out into real life. And over time, he was not carrying just one pain. He was carrying many pains of many people, existing together in the same body. There were moments when he felt like he was living multiple lives at once, not in the positive sense of experience, but in the sense of an inseparable overlap. One part of him was still lingering with an old character, while another part had already begun to live with the new character. And in the middle of all that, his true self became more blurred than ever. Not because it disappeared completely, but because it was overshadowed by too many other voices. The question began to appear, at first very small, very fleeting, but increasingly clear: where is the real Whitaker? Is it the man sitting alone in silence after filming, or is it the people he had lived with for so many years? Is it the emotion he felt right now, or the emotion that some character once had and still remained? When a person has to ask such questions, it is no longer a simple search. It is a sign that a boundary has been blurred for too long. Those around him still saw an artist at the peak of his career, a person who could deliver roles that few could touch. But they did not see the price he was paying every day. They did not see having to wake up and carry emotions that did not belong to him. They did not see having to maintain an outward stability while inside there was constant turmoil. They did not see living in a state that even he could not name. Whitaker did not stop, not because he did not realize what was happening, but because he did not know where stopping would lead. When acting had become the only way for him to understand the world, leaving it was not an easy choice. And so, he continued to accept roles, continued to dig deeper, continued to open himself to emotions that he knew would stay longer than necessary. But every step forward was also a step further from where he had once begun. And over time, that distance was not just a distance of experience, but a distance of identity. A man who had once learned to hide emotions to protect himself was now submerged in too many emotions he could not control. A person who had once lived in silence to find safety now had to live in an inner world noisier than anywhere else. And in all of that, the most terrifying thing was not the increasingly heavy roles or the increasingly extreme emotions. It was that he began to get used to it. When a person becomes accustomed to carrying the pain of others as part of himself, they no longer realize they are being worn down. And that was exactly when the question, where is his true self, was no longer a fleeting thought. It became an obsession, repeating over and over with no clear answer and no way to stay silent in front of it. And then, after all the roles that had gradually eroded the boundary between himself and the character, Forest Whitaker stepped into a role that later not only defined his career, but also became a milestone that made him never able to return to the person he was before the role of Idi Amin in The Last King of Scotland. If the previous characters had forced him to go deep into the dark regions of the human psyche, this time he did not just step into the darkness, he had to live in it, breathe in it, and let it take over every part of his thoughts. Idi Amin was not a simple character to understand. He was one of the most brutal dictators in modern history, a man who had a strange charisma and at the same time carried uncontrollable violence. To embody Amin authentically, Whitaker could not just learn the voice or the walk. He had to understand how a person could smile and order killings at the same time. He had to understand how power could distort the mind, how fear could turn into cruelty, And as always, he did not stand outside to observe. He stepped in completely. Throughout the preparation process, Whitaker did not just research documents. He changed the way he thought. He began to see the world from the perspective of someone who believed he was never wrong, that every action, even the most cruel ones, had a reason. It was not a purely technical process. It was an inner transformation. And the deeper he went, the more he had to face something terrifying. To make the character real, he had to allow some part of himself to accept that character's logic. There were days on set when Whitaker was no longer acting as Amen. He was Amen. The way he looked at others, the way he reacted, the way he existed in the space all carried an energy that even those around him could feel, not because he tried to perform, but because he had let the character take over him, to the point there was no distance left. And that was exactly what made the role haunting, not only for the audience, but for him. But the price of that authenticity did not stop when the camera stopped rolling. When the film ended, Whitaker could not simply step out of Amen like taking off a costume. What he had allowed to enter inside him, the way of thinking, the way of feeling, the way of seeing the world, did not disappear immediately. They stayed, quietly but strong enough to disturb everything. There were moments when he felt like he was still living in the mindset of a person who was not himself, and that did not just make him tired, it made him afraid. No one saw that part. The world only saw the result. When the film was released, Whitaker's performance was praised as one of the greatest in film history. Critics talked about his complete disappearance into the character. Audiences were drawn into every glance, every gesture. And then, the inevitable came. He won the Oscar for Best Actor. A moment any actor would dream of. A peak that very few could reach. But in that moment, there was a painful paradox that no one realized. To reach that peak, Whitaker had to go farther than anyone else. Not only in his career, but in his own mind. And as he stood on stage, holding the golden statue, perhaps even he understood that this was not just a reward for talent. It was recognition for a journey whose price could not be measured by awards. People applauded, people praised, people called his name like a legend, but no one asked what he had to carry to achieve that moment. No one asked how many parts of himself he had left in that role. No one saw the nights after everything ended, when he had to be alone with what remained, emotions that had not yet settled, thoughts that had not yet left, fragments of a person he had lived as for too long. But Whitaker did not talk about that. He did not stand in front of the media and tell about the obsession. He did not share how difficult it was to return to himself. He just continued as he always did, keeping everything inside. But that silence did not mean everything had passed. It only meant he had learned to live with it. And it was precisely in this period that the question which had once been just a fleeting thought now became a real obsession. After everything he had become, how much of him was still truly himself? When a person had lived too long inside the minds of others, including those he knew were dangerous, were cruel, was there still some point inside that remained completely his own? That role had brought Whitaker immortality in art. But at the same time, it also left in him a crack that no one could see, a crack that was not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to change the way he saw the world, the way he saw people, and most importantly, the way he saw himself. And from then on, every step he took forward was not only the journey of a successful actor, but also the journey of a person trying to piece back together what had been torn apart inside him. And then, when the stage lights gradually dimmed, after the moment the whole world called the peak, Forest Whitaker stepped down, not like a man who had just won, but like a man who had just gone through something too big to fully feel. After the role in The Last King of Scotland, his name was no longer in a small group of film lovers. It spread worldwide. He became a symbol of internal acting, a standard that many other actors had to look up to. Top directors sought him out. Big projects opened up before him, enter the world, that was the moment when a person finally received everything he deserved. But inside, everything did not happen that way. There was no explosive feeling of joy. There was no relief, like achieving something long awaited. There was no feeling of, I did it. Instead, there was a very deep, very long silence, a silence that even he himself did not know what to fill with. Because what he had just gone through was not just a role. It was a journey where he had left too many parts of himself there. And when the journey ended, those parts did not automatically return. People often think that success will bring fulfillment, that when you reach the peak, everything will become clearer, easier. But for Whitaker, success was like a mirror that magnified what had already existed inside him before. The loneliness did not disappear. The fatigue did not lessen. The questions about himself had no answers. On the contrary, everything became clearer, heavier, because now there was nothing left to aim for as a final goal. He did not enjoy success in the way others expected. He did not appear continuously in the media to tell about his journey. He did not turn the victory into a story to repeat. He moved on quietly, almost immediately, as if stopping to feel the victory was something foreign to him, as if stopping meant having to face what was left inside, and that was something he was not ready for. Instead of resting, he continued working, and not with lighter, more comfortable roles as a way to balance things out. He continued to choose complex, heavy, conflict-filled characters. People that to understand them, he had to go deeper once again into emotional territories he already knew would leave marks. Not because he had no other choice, but because that was the only way he knew to exist in the world he had created for himself. A loop began to form, very discreet, very hard to notice from the outside. He took on a difficult role. He went deep into it. He brought back emotions he could not completely shake off. He completed the role with an authenticity that amazed everyone. He was praised, honored, and then, instead of stopping, he continued. Another role, another journey, another layer of emotion added, and the loop continued like that, with no clear stopping point. Success, in Whitaker's case, was not a destination. It became the driving force for him to keep going farther on the path he already knew was not easy to return from. Each time he was recognized, he became even more tightly bound to the image of someone who go deep into the dark regions of humanity. And to maintain that position, he had to continue doing the same, even going farther. Not because he wanted to prove anything, but because the world had gotten used to seeing him that way. There were moments, perhaps, when he also wondered if there was another way. A way to exist without having to carry so much. A way to act without having to trade so many parts of himself. But those questions did not last long. Because when a person had gone too far down a path, turning back was no longer an easy choice. Not because it was impossible, but because he no longer knew who he would become if he did that. Whitaker continued to move forward, with a determination that from the outside looked like strength, but inside it was a continuation driven by instinct, like a person who could not stop in the middle of a journey they no longer clearly remembered the starting point of. And in all of that, the feeling of victory still did not come. Not because he did not deserve it, but because what he had to trade to achieve it had changed the way he felt about everything. Loneliness, at this point, was no longer something he even noticed. It no longer appeared as a clear feeling. It became the foundation of everything, a state in which every thought, every action, every decision took place. He no longer compared it to anything else, because he no longer clearly remembered what it felt like without it. And it was precisely in that state that he continued to work, continued to live, continued to carry pieces of lives that did not belong to him. The world continued to honor him. Awards, praises, titles continued to be given. But amid all of that, there was a quiet truth that existed, that there were victories that did not bring the feeling of victory. There were peaks that did not bring release. And there were people who, even standing in a position many dreamed of, still had to keep moving forward, not because they wanted to, but because they no longer knew how to stop. And Whitaker, in all his silence, continued to walk like that, not like a man enjoying success, but like a man carrying it, as part of a burden he had never truly put down. In the middle of the inescapable loop of success and increasingly heavy roles, Forest Whitaker tried to do something that for him was perhaps even harder than embodying any character building a family. When he met and married Keisha Nash Whitaker, it was not just a romantic relationship. It was an effort to hold on to a real-life part, a place without a script, without characters, without emotions borrowed from others. A place where he could, at least in hope, become himself in the simplest way. They built their life together in privacy, staying away from excessive spotlight, away from the noise that the film industry always brought. There were no scandals, no public displays of affection. Everything happened quietly, just like the way Whitaker always chose to exist. Family became a space he tried to protect, a quiet zone amid all the turmoil he carried from work. There, he did not need to become a king, a dictator, or a man torn by the past. He just needed to be a husband, a father. But that very thing became the biggest challenge. Because to be present in a family, a person does not only need to be there physically, they need to be there emotionally. They need the ability to share, to connect, to respond, and sometimes simply to listen without carrying complicated layers of thought. And that was exactly what Whitaker, after many years living in overlapping inner worlds, could no longer do naturally. There were moments when he was there, sitting in the same room, listening to the same story, joining the same meal, but a part of him was still somewhere else. It could be in a role that had not ended. It could be in an emotion that had not been processed. It could be in a void he could not name. And that distance, at first very small, very hard to notice, gradually became clearer over time. Keisha was not an outsider. She was there, seeing him every day, sensing the change even if she could not always explain it. It was not big conflicts, not fierce arguments. It was longer silences than usual. Times when he did not react as expected. Moments when he seemed to be there, but was not really there. And in a relationship, sometimes the things not spoken are exactly what make the distance grow. Whitaker tried. He was not indifferent to his family. On the contrary, perhaps precisely because he understood the value of a stable place, he wanted even more to hold on to it. But desire and ability did not always go hand in hand. When a person had grown used to handling emotions in their own way, opening up naturally became a difficult thing. Not because they did not want to, but because they did not know where to begin. Family, for Whitaker, gradually became a paradox. It was the place he wanted to return to, but also the place where he felt he did not fully belong, not because the people in it did not accept him, but because he himself could not bring his whole self there. A part of him was always held back in his work, in the characters, in the emotions that had not been released. And when a person cannot bring their full self into a relationship, that relationship, no matter how solid it is, begins to show cracks. The years passed, and on the surface the family still maintained its stability. There were no clear signs that something was changing. But inside, the distance continued to grow quietly. Not distance caused by conflict, but distance caused by lack of connection. A void that no one intentionally created, but no one knew how to fill. Whitaker was still present. He still did the things a husband, a father needed to do. But sometimes that presence felt like a role performed correctly, but missing something very hard to name. And perhaps he himself realized that in a vague way. But like so many other things in his life, he did not speak it out. He did not explain. He just continued, hoping that everything would find its own balance. But there are things in life that do not balance themselves if there is no confrontation. And when a person has grown used to avoiding their own emotions, confronting the emotions of others becomes even harder. Family, which should have been a place for healing, instead became the clearest mirror reflecting what he had not been able to resolve inside. And in all of that, there existed a very quiet sadness that there are things a person wants to hold on to more than anything else but does not know how to keep. Not because they do not love enough, but because they do not know how to make that love felt completely. Whitaker did not lose his family in a single moment. He gradually drifted away from it, little by little, in the very silence he had carried throughout his life. And perhaps that was one of the most painful losses. Not losing something suddenly, but realizing that he had been there, had tried, had wanted to keep it, but still could not stop the distance from growing larger. Not because the outside world was too noisy, but because his inner world had never truly been quiet. And then, as something almost inevitable when the distance had quietly grown over many years, the marriage of Forest Whitaker and Keisha Nash Whitaker entered a stage where there were no longer clear breakdowns, but also no longer the connection as before. They had walked together for more than 2 decades a period, long enough to build a family, to share important moments, to become an inseparable part of each other's lives. But that same period, with everything that had accumulated without being spoken, gradually turned into a silence that both could feel but did not know where to begin to change. There was no specific event that marked the crack. There was no big incident, no loud arguments, no sensational headlines. Everything happened in a way that very few could notice, slowly, almost invisibly. It was conversations becoming shorter, moments of silence stretching longer, emotions no longer shared naturally, and over time those small things, when repeated long enough, formed a distance that no one could cross easily. Whitaker was still there. Keisha was too. They were still present in the same space, still performing the familiar roles of a family. But that presence gradually became more like two parallel people than two connected people, not because they did not care about each other, but because they no longer reached each other in the way they once had. And the most painful thing was that both probably realized it, but there was no clear way to change it. Some relationships end with an explosion, but there are also relationships that end with silence. And that silence, in a way, is even heavier, because it does not allow people to release. It does not allow them to say everything they have held back. It does not allow a clear ending. It just drags on until there is nothing left to hold on to. When the decision to divorce was made, it was not the result of a single moment, but the consequence of many years of accumulation. There was no public resentment. There were no detailed explanations. There were no stories told for the public to understand. Just an announcement, brief, almost cold, closing a long chapter that from the outside many had once thought was solid. And the very way it ended, quietly, discreetly, without noise, said a lot about who Whitaker was. He did not turn the loss into a story to share. He did not use it as a way to seek sympathy. He kept it inside, the way he had kept almost everything important in his life. But that did not mean it did not exist. It did not mean it left no mark. A marriage that lasted more than 20 years does not disappear without leaving a void. Not a void that is easy to see, but a void that lies in habits, in memories, in moments where there used to always be two people. And when one of them is no longer there, that absence does not need to be spoken to be felt. Whitaker did not talk about that pain. But perhaps he did not need to, because for a person who had grown used to carrying emotions without sharing, this loss was just another part, added one more part he continued to carry, the way he had done with so many other things in his life, not because he did not want to let go, but because he did not know how to do it the way others do. There is a very special sadness in losses that no one sees. There is no confirmation from the outside. No one comes and says, "I understand." There is no moment to stop and truly feel it. It just exists, quietly, as part of the flow of life, blending into everything that came before. And for Whitaker, this loss did not come like a storm. It came like slowly rising water until he realized he was standing in a place where everything had changed. What made it more painful was not that it happened, but the way it happened. There was no point to and say, "This is when everything ended." There was no moment to look back and clearly understand what had gone wrong. There was only a feeling that, somehow, what had once been very close had become distant, and there was no way to pull it back as before. And in all of that, perhaps Whitaker understood something that not everyone is ready to face. That there are losses in life that cannot be explained, cannot be fixed, and also cannot be shared completely. They can only be carried. And for a person who had lived too long in silence, carrying them was perhaps the only thing he knew how to do. That marriage did not end with a collapse. It ended with the quiet disappearance of something that had once been very important, and that very silence made it deeper, more painful, because it did not allow a clear release. It only left a void that no one saw, but for the person inside, it was always present. In every moment they remembered that there had once been something there, and now there was no longer. After the things that seemed most enduring in life quietly drifted away, Forest Whitaker did not return to the spotlight as a way to fill the void. Instead, he turned onto a different path, not to seek recognition, but as a quiet effort to find meaning in himself again. He began to spend more time on humanitarian activities, especially his role as a goodwill ambassador for UNESCO. It was not a move for show, not a way to build his reputation. For Whitaker, it was another journey, a journey where he did not need to become someone else, did not need to get into a role, did not need to strain himself to understand emotions he had already become too familiar with. He went to places where pain did not need to be performed, communities that had gone through war, violence, loss, places where people did not need stage lights to tell their stories, because their very existence was already a story. Whitaker did not stand above them like a celebrity coming to help. He sat down, listened, observed just as he had done since he was a child. But this time, that observation was not aimed at turning into a character. It was a way for him to connect, to touch a part of the world not covered by art. There were times when, looking into the eyes of people who had lost so much, Whitaker saw something very familiar, not the same circumstances. His life had not gone through war or poverty like theirs, but pain at some deep level took on a similar shape. The loss, the emptiness, the feeling of being separated from what had once been part of oneself. And in those moments, he was no longer an actor trying to understand a character. He was a person seeing himself, reflected in the stories of others. Whitaker began to take part in peace-building projects, working with youth in conflict zones, helping them find a path other than violence. He did not bring simple solutions. He brought presence of presence he hoped could make a difference, even if only a small one. And perhaps, in the process, he was also trying to do the same for himself. Find a path that did not require going deep into dark regions to feel he was alive. But healing is not a linear process. It does not come just because a person decides they want to change. Whitaker could help others see hope, could encourage them to step out of cycles of suffering. But the things he carried from his own life did not easily disappear just because he had found a new meaning. The voids were still there. The questions still existed, and the parts of him that had been left behind in the roles, in the relationships, in the years of silence, did not automatically return just because he had stepped into a new chapter. There were days when the humanitarian work brought him a rare sense of relief, a feeling that this time what he was doing was not to recreate pain, but to reduce it, a feeling that he was touching the world in a different, way more real, more direct, without the medium of art. But there were also days when, even while standing among people who needed help, he still felt a very familiar distance, not because he did not care, but because a part of him was still held back somewhere else, in places he had not fully left. Whitaker did not quit acting. He could not. It was still a part of him, whether he wanted it or not. But he began to seek balance, something he had not had for many years. He tried to dedicate time to things not related to roles, not related to becoming someone else. He tried to live as a person, not as a collection of characters. But that was not easy when you had grown used to seeing the world through many different layers of emotion. There was a quiet paradox in this journey. Whitaker helped others find themselves again while he himself was still searching for the same thing. He spoke about peace, about healing, about facing the past. But there were parts of his own past that had not been touched in that way, not because he avoided them, but because he had not yet found a way to do so without breaking what was left even more. And perhaps the truest thing in everything he did was not how many people he could save or how many changes he could create. It was that he kept trying, even while knowing that there were things inside himself that had not yet been resolved. He did not stand in the position of someone who had fully healed to help others. He stood there as a person still carrying wounds, but choosing not to let them define his entire self. The voids did not disappear. They were not completely filled. But they were no longer everything. And in that imperfection, in that unfinished journey, Whitaker continued to move forward, not as a person who had found the answers, but as a person who accepted that some questions would always remain, and the only thing he could do was keep living, keep searching, and keep trying, in the way he knew. And then, after all the paths he had traveled, the roles, the losses, the efforts to find meaning, Forest Whitaker's life gradually slowed down in a way that from the outside could easily be mistaken for peace. He appeared less. He took part less in noisy projects. He stood before the public less than before. Interviews became fewer. Red carpet appearances were no longer as frequent. And in the eyes of many, that was a sign of a man who had passed his peak and was choosing a quiet life after many years of dedication. But for Whitaker, that slowing down was not simply a relaxing choice. It was the result of a journey he could no longer continue in the same way as before. He no longer chased roles like in the early years of his career, no longer searched for extreme characters to prove something, no longer threw himself into projects just to go deeper once again into the dark regions of humanity, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he had understood through his own experience that there were limits that if crossed too many times, a person could not return as before. And Whitaker, after everything, was no longer looking to become someone else. He began to face a different challenge, harder, quieter, returning to himself, but returning did not mean erasing what had happened. The roles did not disappear. The emotions did not dissolve. The voids did not fill themselves just because time passed. Everything was still there in the way he saw the world, in the way he reacted to the smallest things, in the moments when he suddenly realized he was remembering an emotion with no clear source. Life did not become lighter just because he slowed down. It only became clearer. There is a very subtle difference between silence and peace. Silence can just be the absence of sound, but peace requires the absence of inner turmoil. And for Whitaker, the silence he was living in was not completely peace. It was a form of acceptance. Acceptance that some parts of himself would always carry traces of what he had been through. Acceptance that not every question needed an answer. And most importantly, acceptance that becoming himself, after all the years he had lived as others, was not an easy process. He learned to live with himself in a way he had never done before, not by avoiding, not by transforming emotions into roles, but by staying with them, even when they were not comfortable. There were days when that meant sitting in silence a little longer. There were days when it meant accepting that he did not need to understand everything to keep going. And there were days when it simply meant existing without needing to become anyone else. Whitaker did not talk much about this phase of his life. He did not write books recounting his journey. He did not appear to analyze what he had been through, but that very silence, in a way, said a lot. It showed that he no longer sought confirmation from the outside, no longer needed to explain himself, no longer needed to prove anything. He just lived. And in that simplicity there was a kind of strength that not everyone could achieve. However, acceptance is not a perfect state. It does not erase the pain. It does not make everything easy. It only creates a space where a person can exist with what they carry without being completely controlled by it. And Whitaker, after everything, was learning to exist in that space, not as a person who had fully healed, but as a person who had stopped running away. There were rare moments, perhaps, when he looked back at his journey and realized that everything he had been through, from the roles, the losses, the efforts to search, had shaped the man he was today. Not a lighter man, not a simpler man, but a deeper man, a more complex man, and in a way, a more authentic man. Because authenticity does not come from having no wounds, but from accepting them as part of oneself. Whitaker's life now was no longer noisy. There were no more constant sprints, no more peaks to conquer. But it was also not a light life. It was a life with weight, the weight of memories, of experiences, of pieces of life that had passed and could not return. And in that weight, he continued to walk, not fast, not slow, just enough to keep himself from standing still. And perhaps after everything, that was the closest thing to peace he could achieve. Not the absence of everything, but the ability to carry it all and still keep living. And when looking back at that entire journey, Forest Whitaker's life did not appear as a straight line of success, but like a series of overlapping circles, each circle a person he had once lived as, an emotion he had once carried, a part of himself he had once left behind. From the boy who learned to stay silent to survive, to the man who lost his first dream and was forced to search for another path, then to an actor who stepped into the world of other people as a way to escape himself. All were not separate phases. They connected with one another, forming a story in which every choice led to a price and every step forward brought a trade-off. Whitaker had lived dozens of lives, not in a purely metaphorical sense, but in a very real way. He had felt the pain of people who had never existed in his life, had carried memories that were not his own, had let emotions that did not belong to him become part of himself, and that was exactly what made him different. Not just an actor with technique, but a person with the ability to touch layers so deep that others did not dare to touch. But that was also what made his journey heavier than anyone could see. There was a paradox that ran through his entire life. The more lives he lived, the harder it became to escape his own life. Because no matter who he became on screen, a king, a dictator, a man torn by the past when the lights went out, he still had to return to himself. And when he returned, he did not just bring that person back, but also everything he had absorbed during the process of becoming them. There was no complete escape. There was no way to fully separate what was his and what he had borrowed from others. But perhaps what made Whitaker's story special was not how many parts of himself he had lost, but that he had never completely collapsed under it. He continued to move forward, not with certainty, not with clear answers, but with a very quiet endurance, a persistence that did not come from knowing where he was going, but from not allowing himself to stop, even when the road ahead was unclear. Whitaker's legacy, therefore, did not lie only in the films he had been in or the awards he had received. Those things, though important, were only the surface of something deeper. His real legacy lay in the way he had lived, the way he faced the most difficult parts of being human, not by avoiding them, but by diving in, the way he accepted going into the dark regions that others did not want to look at, and brought them to light in the most authentic way possible. He was not a perfect legend. His life was not a neat story with a gentle ending. There were parts of his journey that were still unfinished, There were questions without answers. There were voids that time could not fill. But perhaps that was exactly what made his story more real, because it reflected exactly how life works: imperfect, unbalanced, but always continuing. Whitaker did not escape himself, and perhaps after everything he no longer tried to do that anymore. Instead, he learned to live with everything he had been through: the roles, the losses, the pains, and even the rare moments of clarity. He did not need to return to the person he once was, because that person had changed. And accepting that change, in a way, was the deepest form of growth. There was a very quiet beauty in the way he existed in the present. Not the beauty of perfection, but the beauty of a person who had been through a lot and still stood firm. Not because he was unaffected, but because he did not let those effects define his entire self. He carried them, but did not let them pull him down completely. And in that fragile balance, he continued to live not as a character, but as a real person, with all the complexity that brought. When the world looked back at Forest Whitaker, they might see a great actor, a man who had left an indelible mark on cinema. But if they looked deeper, they would see a different story, a story of endurance, of living with the most difficult parts of himself, of never truly escaping what had shaped him, but still continuing to move forward. And perhaps that was exactly what made him most memorable. Not because he had lived so many lives, but because in all those lives he still kept enough of himself to continue existing. Not as an untouchable legend, but as a human being, a man who had been through so much and was still here, in his own silence, continuing to live, continuing to carry, and continuing to become himself in the only way he knew. The story of Forest Whitaker not only makes people admire, but also leaves a very quiet sadness, a sadness that comes from a man who had to live so deeply in the roles that he lost himself piece by piece. When looking back at his journey, from the boy who withdrew into silence at the beginning of the story, to the collapse when the football injury took away his only dream, then finding acting as a refuge, we see clearly that everything was not perfect choices, but a chain of reactions to survive, especially at the climax with the role in The Last King of Scotland, when he achieved the prestigious Oscar but had to carry a prolonged psychological obsession. The story showed a painful truth: success does not always come with healing. And when the marriage of more than 2 decades with Keisha Nash Whitaker ended in silence, without scandal, without explanation, that was another proof that the deepest losses are often the ones no one sees. What makes people ache the most is not that he suffered, but that he endured it all in silence, from carrying the emotions of dozens of characters, to living in a family where he was present but could not connect fully. However, it was precisely in that endurance that he became a respected symbol, not because of perfection, but because of his persistence and honesty with the craft. For American society, this story is a profound reminder that in a culture that values success and achievement, we should not judge people only by what they have achieved, but need to look at what they have had to sacrifice. It also highlights the importance of mental health care, of learning to share instead of enduring alone, and of maintaining connection with family before the distance becomes irreparable. If the story of Forest Whitaker made you reflect, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to appreciate what he has silently endured throughout his life. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that few truly understand.